Greetings, friends of liberty. When speaking of human beings with range, one could hardly avoid mentioning our swan of Avon, William Shakespeare, and the extraordinary extent on any of numerous dimensions by which range characterizes his collected work. Number one, in the variety and range of feelings expressed, from the indecision of Hamlet to the jealousy of Othello and the madness of Lear and the innocence of star-crossed lovers. Number two, to the wide variety of themes, from treacherous murder to the profound tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, to the ambition of a Macbeth, to Shylock's hard frugality. And finally, number three, the range of characters, from Bottom to Angelo to Antony and Cleopatra to Lady Macbeth to the scolding of a shrewish Kate. No, 'tis indisputable, the extraordinary range of our bard, in every possible measure. But we also find, if we turn to your 21st century, that one could hardly find a topic more germane than the subject of this book, both personally for how we as individuals can maximize the chance we will find that professional activity in life at which we both excel and are happy, and secondly, how our societies can maximize the chance of productively utilizing knowledge to continue making scientific and technological breakthroughs possible. Such an examination is indeed the inspiring goal and laudable aim of journalist David Epstein's 2019 book, Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a World of Specialists. His previous work, The Sports Gene, dealt with the possible relation of genetic factors to sports and athletic performance. He begins this book by showcasing the radically different approach of two world-class athletes, both of whom ended up at the pinnacle of their respective sports, Tiger Woods and Roger Federer. Tiger, on the one hand, was famously and constantly encouraged by his father from a very early age, had appeared already in the Michael Douglas shows at age 2 to show off his driving and putting skills, had beaten his father by age 11 on a standard 18-hole golf course, and single-mindedly dreamt of breaking Jack Nicklaus's record of 18 majors. Roger, on the other hand, number one, instead sampled squash, skiing, wrestling, swimming, skateboarding, basketball, handball, tennis, table tennis, badminton, and soccer, the only real condition for serious interest being that sports had to involve a ball. Number two, he didn't practice with or involve his parents, partly because, as his mom said, it wouldn't have been any fun for her since he tried out every strange stroke and certainly never returned a ball normally. And number three, because his tennis career goals were confined to really just once meeting Boris Becker or being able to play at Wimbledon sometime. The obvious question then poses itself not just for golf, but for sports generally. Are more great sportsmen early specialists like Tiger or generalists like Roger? Although many people imagine that more are early specialists, what sports researchers found was that most elite athletes growing up practice less than near elite on their specific sport, around 3 hours per week as opposed to 5 at age 10, and around 8 hours per week as opposed to 11 at age 13. And they, like Roger, tried out different sports more. So the popular idea to start an athlete young and get him 10,000 hours of deliberate, focused practice on the skills of that sport, in most cases, turns out to be counterproductive. And why is that? In a nutshell, because most kids, unlike Tiger, don't know what they want yet. Sampling a broader range of experience helps them discover that. One of the fundamental issues involved in learning and productive practice is, of course, the type of learning required to excel at any given activity or sport. So with golf, it's practicing the same driving and putting strokes again and again and again. And here, to illustrate one fundamental issue, Epstein describes for us the famous case of the Hungarian Polgar sisters, Susan, Sophia, and Judith, trained by their father Laszlo, just like Tiger was from a very early age. Laszlo conceived of a comprehensive program to maximize their chess abilities by starting Susan out just with pawns initially at age 3. Number 2, then introducing her to a chess club for girls, she quickly becoming the champion there. Number 3, hiring experts when his daughter needed more challenge and instruction than he could provide. And number 4, making a huge database of games, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, so that they could have a preview of upcoming opponents and their style of play. And finally, number 5, getting his daughters to join the national women's team, leading to their outstanding success, with Judith becoming at one point the ladies' world champion. These, then, were the female chess equivalents of Tiger. And what did their father, Laszlo Polgar, conclude? That if the same approach were applied to 1,000 children, humanity could tackle problems like cancer and AIDS. But as Epstein says, whether this kind of training in other subjects is possible is unclear, since just how much of the world and how much of the things humans want to learn and do are really like chess and golf. And here we find that since chess is really a very circumscribed type of activity as activities go, with the same number of pieces and 2 opponents, as a result, chess grandmasters, given all their years of experience, develop the ability to recognize successful and unsuccessful patterns in winning and losing, which enables them to operate much more efficiently the more experience they get. And this is the equivalent of golfers practicing their putting strokes 10,000 times before age 8. These kinds of learning environments are called kind learning environments because they're so structured and predictable. In golf, you just swing and get immediate feedback of where and how far the bar went. It is in these structured environments that the brute force algorithms found in chess computers like IBM's Deep Blue and even today's handheld apps can excel. As Garry Kasparov, former world champion from 1985 to 2000, says, "Today the free chess app on your mobile phone is stronger than me." But as it turns out, although Kasparov was beaten by IBM's Deep Blue because it was better at brute force tactical chess, humans are actually better, at least at present, at strategic thinking, because this learning environment, called a wicked learning environment, is much more open-minded and unstructured with delayed and ambiguous feedback, which confuses computers. And so it turns out that when very capable strategic thinkers directed these chess computers to do the tactical work, they doing the strategic, this combination of human and machine teamwork, called a centaur, trounced the best chess computer in the world, Hydra, thus saving our pride for at least another few years. And who is one of these brilliant strategic thinkers? Anson Williams, a British engineer with no official chess rating, probably at the level of a decent amateur. But he knew how to think strategically and how to direct the chess computers, partly since he had played lots of the real-time computer strategy game Command and Conquer. The conclusion then? AI systems are like savants. They need stable structures and narrow worlds. And this is why no so-called idiot savant has ever won a Nobel Prize. Their minds are much too dedicated to one very limited skill. Think Rain Man. But what does characterize many Nobel Prize winners? Range. As Epstein says, Nobel laureates are at least 22 times more likely to partake as an amateur actor, dancer, magician, or other type of performer. Nationally recognized scientists are much more likely than other scientists to be musicians, sculptors, painters, printmakers, woodcutters, mechanics, electronics tinkerers, glassblowers, poets, or writers of both fiction and nonfiction. And again, Nobel laureates are far more likely still. As summarized by Spanish Nobel laureate Santiago Ramón y Cajal, it appears as though they're scattering and dissipating their energies, while in reality, they're channeling and strengthening them. And the opposite is precisely what Epstein complains is one disadvantage of modern educational systems, which tend to focus too much on specialization and thus are too narrow, with, for example, typical majors in chemistry and biology really often not having any much general knowledge about other sciences or even the real world. I would wholeheartedly agree here, but this is largely a function of other issues, such as, number one, because college education is so subsidized, with way too many students getting PhDs, it means there's an oversupply, which means they need to specialize themselves to distinguish themselves from one another. And number two, partly because of tenure, which requires constant publication, oftentimes of useless papers. A purely private and unsubsidized system of higher education would eliminate this present hyperspecialization. In his next section, he presents one of his most detailed case studies, returning us to the Baroque period in the canals of 17th century Venice, in the extraordinary all-female cast known as the Figlie del Coro, literally daughters of the choir. And did these female musicians have range with a capital R? Not for them just learning voice, like soprano Barbara Bonney, or piano like Vladimir Horowitz, or violin like Anne-Sophie Mutter. No, these musicians played many different instruments, and given their skill, Vivaldi composed over 200 concertos for them. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, visiting them once and brought almost to the heights of romantic ecstasy merely by listening to their playing, lost much of his amorous inspiration when, at his express wish, they pulled back the curtain behind which they played, which revealed that many were missing an eye, a foot, or a finger, which sufficed to extinguish Jean-Jacques' passion. As Epstein says, the girls and women who delighted delicate ears had not lived delicate lives. Many of their mothers worked in Venice's vibrant sex industry and contracted syphilis before they had babies and dropped them off at the Ospedale della Pietà, the hospital of pity. What Epstein wants to argue with this example is not clear, since he's not just saying they tried various instruments in their youth during a sampling period like Roger Federer, different sports, but also that they continue to play these instruments their whole life long. However, for modern 21st century musicians, given the enormous present worldwide competition for top spots in orchestras, it's not likely that most, simply being human, would have the skill to play 2 or 3 instruments competitively. However, perhaps realizing this, Epstein returns to his first justification, that of childhood sampling, giving the negative example of the daughter of Tiger Mom Amy Chua, who gave up playing violin at 13 because she was forced into it initially. As her daughter said of the violin, "You picked it, not me." His next historical example of the use of range couldn't have been more momentous in the history of science and the scientific method itself. That of Johannes Kepler, working in the astronomical observatory of Tycho Brahe and creatively using his own series of analogies from a wide range of examples in the real world to further amplify the theory and understanding of the laws of planetary motion. The crux of the problem was that, in the world as we know it, one object usually has to hit another object to move it. So one billiard ball hitting another, or Mike Tyson's fist hitting the head of Trevor Berbick to knock him to the ground. But with the sun and the planets and the earth and the moon, there was no interaction, so how could they possibly affect each other? To understand this, Kepler again incorporated a wide range of examples, realizing, number one, that the light from the sun works at a distance, with no observable manifestation of its power in between. Number two, the moon too actually works at a distance on the earth, creating and affecting the tides. Number three, that magnets essentially work at a distance, with a magnetic force diminishing at a distance. And finally, four, among others, he used the analogy of boats being moved by the currents in a stream. As Kepler concluded of his intellectual approach, "I especially love analogies, my most faithful masters, acquainted with all the secrets of nature. One should make great use of them. And he was right, since all this helped him make the theoretical breakthroughs that he did, which led subsequently to the further advances of Isaac Newton. Having seen Kepler's superb employment of analogies, let's entertain Epstein's next proposed instance of the value of range, here with occupational experimentation. He telling of a peculiar man who tried, number one, first selling artworks for his uncle, number two, teaching and tutoring students, excuse me, number three, clerking in a bookstore, number four, ministering as a pastor to minors and the poor, and number five, finally, painting. Now, you must understand that as a child of the 18th century, much of the art of your modernity, with its music of Stravinsky and John Cage, inane scribblings of James Joyce's Ulysses, and the cynicism of your Ernest Hemingway, to the paintings of Picasso and Kandinsky, could never appeal to me. And so too, Vincent van Gogh and his violent and disturbed paintings would never be found on the walls of my dwellings, although I might possibly buy them for their resale value. And thus, this example of occupational range that so impresses Epstein and he wishes to provide remains, in my view, unconvincing. But his next instance of occupational range, however, appears more instructive by examining the specific case of why various plebes to the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, dropped out of the Army eventually. Here he utilized Angela Duckworth's path-breaking psychological study, which found essentially that grit, in other words, stick-to-itiveness, is sometimes overrated in terms of finding happiness, because having enough persistence to force yourself to do or complete something that you truly don't want to do and won't make you happy is obviously counterproductive. And so naturally, it irks the Army that after spending so much time and treasure, that after the required 5 years of active duty, 50% of all officers immediately quit. That 3/4 are gone before the 20-year mark in their pension, and that the more likely the Army is to identify someone as a successful future officer and spend money on them, the more likely they are to leave as soon as possible. As Epstein concludes, from the military's perspective, this is all a major backfire. And why does this happen? Again, because young people appear to need freedom to discover what they truly want. So having to commit themselves so early in life doesn't facilitate that process. As one former officer said, "I've yet to meet a classmate who left the Army and regretted it." Skipping the next case, Frances Hesselbein, who successfully reorganized the Girl Scouts, let's examine the activities of Alf Bingham, head of development and research at famed drug company Eli Lilly. Bingham, wanting to solve 21 perennial problems that had remained as thorns in the side of the Eli Lilly research department, decided on a novel approach. Simply publish the problems on a website for everyone to peruse and contemplate in their complexity. At first, of course, suits being what they are, his superiors resisted. But when they finally relented and gave him the green light, what happened? Using the extraordinary knowledge collected on the internet, distributed among so many disconnected individuals, all approaching these problems in a wide variety of unique ways, what happened is that numerous problems ended up being solved. As Bingham said, strangers were creating substances that had befuddled Eli Lilly chemists. It validated the hypothesis we had going in, but it still surprised me how these knowledge pockets were hidden under other degrees. So although our author continues to give us many more examples, describing, number one, how the Nintendo Game Boy was created, number two, how 3M invented an astonishing new glitter that reflected light so easily that it blazed as if the vial of glitter held a colony of magical prismatic fireflies. Number three, how free market economist Julian Simon trounced Paul Ehrlich, professor emeritus of population studies of the Department of Biology at Stanford University, who had predicted that humanity would face an apocalyptic civilizational crisis of starvation and overpopulation in the 1970s. And number 4, the engineering and administrative decisions that led to the explosion of the shuttle Columbia. Let's wrap up by summarizing 2 final cases. The first of Charles Darwin and the second of Jill Viles of Iowa. So remember how us humans beat the best chess computer in the world, Hydra? With one British Command and Conquer video gamer directing chess computers to do the tactical grunt work of calculating algorithmic possibilities, while he took over the strategic responsibilities? Well, it turns out that Charles Darwin operated similarly, in not specializing too much in any given area of the natural sciences, but being more concerned about gathering information so he could pull the big evolutionary picture together. And how did that work out? So, for example, after doing a paper on barnacles, he said, "Bored, I am unwilling to spend any more time on this subject." Instead, he had at least 231 scientific pen pals, grouped roughly into 13 broad themes based on his interests, from worms to human sexual selection. He peppered them with questions, and then created notebooks by subject matter to organize all this incoming material. In this way, he was an informational strategist, integrating the flow of knowledge for maximal scientific discovery and productivity, just like Anson Williams, our Command and Conquer general. One final example of range and integration at both a personal and social level involves Iowa mother Jill Viles, born with a genetic anomaly which caused her muscles to slowly atrophy over time. While as a child she had little problem walking or running, by the time she entered school she kept tripping, and by the age of 12 she could no longer manage roller skating. Even as a youngster, she searched for answers. The best solution she then found in the library being poltergeists. But by the time she entered college, she was teaching herself genetics by studying up to 25 hours a week, and then one day, leafing through a journal of muscular diseases, identified the actual genetic disorder, Emery-Dreifuss, that her undiagnosed father likely had, by noticing from the pictures in the journal the exact same type of muscular definition on his arm muscles. At home, on college break, she and her father discussed her research, and by telling him that he likely had Emery-Dreifuss, which also results in increasing cardiac debilitation, was able to get him to a hospital. There, checking out his heart rate, doctors saw that at times it decreased to under 30 beats per minute, and so were able to install a pacemaker and forestall imminent heart failure. Continuing her studies in 1995, Ms. Viles sent her accumulated research to an Italian genetics institute, and then sent them blood samples through the mail when they requested DNA. 4 years later, she heard back from them via email, they confirming that she and many in her family had what's called an LMNA mutation, which meant they all had Emery-Dreifuss. Much later, after her father had eventually died of his condition, she started wondering about the role of fat in Emery-Dreifuss. And noticing a female Canadian Olympic sprinter with virtually no body fat, had the idea that while they were both similar in having no fat, the sprinter's body was also churning out huge amounts of muscle, which may have indicated a possible variation. As Jill said of her genetic anomaly, "This is my kryptonite, but is her rocket fuel." And to make a long story short, she contacted the sprinter through our author, and after testing, it turned out that they both had a rare lipodystrophy, called Dunnage type, but that the genetic mistakes were not located on the exact same spot, resulting in enormous muscle growth for the sprinter, but the exact opposite, muscle wasting, for Jill. As the expert in lipodystrophy said, who did the test on them both, "I can understand. A patient can learn more about their disease. But to reach out to someone else and figure out their problem also, it is a remarkable feat." Jill then contacted another hyper-specialist who studies a protein called SREBP1, which helps cells determine whether to use fat from a meal right away or store it for later fuel. And that when the protein builds up in animals, it can cause either extreme muscle atrophy or extreme muscle growth. Bingo! She emailed that specialist, pointing out that this final difference may be the difference between her and the Olympic sprinter. What was the response of the specialist? That's a really good question. That's a really, really good question. I had no idea of what I can do with genetic diseases before she contacted me. Now I've changed the path of my team. So Jill had finally put all the different pieces of her complicated and puzzling genetic anomaly together, thereby helping herself, many others, and through intellectual and medical persistence, furthering this vital genetic research. What a woman. So concluding on this remarkable and inspirational story of a heroic amateur scientist, how should we grade this book? I think it just squeaks by with a B+, A-. Does it have any weaknesses? On a personal level, Epstein sees full well how important freedom is for young and older people to experiment with, over and over again, showing how vital the flexibility to change sports or interests or occupations is. The only point he really misses is the necessity for freedom also at the societal and economic level for maximal productive social integration of knowledge to occur. If he got that, this book would be an A. And as I previously argued, he failed to see how over or hyper-specialization in colleges is caused by the fact that their operations and funding is and has long been interfered with, provided by and managed by government in many ways. A typical example of the better private use of scientific information was the Human Genome Project, which was vastly accelerated by the brilliant scientist and entrepreneur Craig Ventner and his private Celera Corporation, which used much more productive methods of analysis in mapping the human genome than its rival United States government project. Celera's method cost, by some estimates, only 10% as much while mapping the genome quicker, and all because it used a wider range of productive information more efficiently. On that note of praise and the reminder of the necessity for liberty, both personal and economic, I bid you all well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.